Well, good evening, everyone.
Evening.
I, I would just like to say thank you very much for joining us for tonight's webinar, our second in this three-part series focused on just electoral peace. Last week, we explored the electoral landscape through the lens of reconciliation and trust, while our presenters last week unpacked the electoral tensions that have marred the political environment in Guyana, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago. They also provided us with ideas that could potentially help us to arrive at a point in our history where, by addressing historical hurts and trauma, educating the populace, and working together, can result in us achieving a socially just and lasting peace in our society. Tonight, we have an equally enriching discussion under the theme Systems Strengthening. Before we get started, we kindly ask that you take a moment to rename your device or Zoom name to reflect your full name and country. This helps us to keep track of participants, manage the discussion more smoothly, and to ensure everyone gets the most out of tonight's webinar. If you are not sure how to do this, simply hover over your name in the participants list, click more and select rename. If you need any help, please feel free to message our support team in the chat. Kindly ensure that you keep your microphones on mute during the presentations or discussions to avoid background noise. And we know that you will have burning thoughts and experiences, as well as questions as the presenters share their perspectives. We urge you to share your thoughts or questions in the chat during the session. These will be addressed by the panelists during the dedicated question and answer segment at the end. Also, this session is being recorded and a copy will be shared with participants afterward. If for any reason you experience any technical difficulties, please message our support team in the chat and we'll try our best to assist. At this point, I wish to remind you that the series is being organized by a core group of concerned Guyanese with support from the Roman Catholic Church in Guyana, building on the late Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli Tutti, which encourages the increased global use of political dialogue. And so now I invite Bishop Francis Allen, OSB, Bishop of Georgetown. Bishop Allen has been serving the Guyanese diocese for approximately 21 years. So we can almost say that he's Guyanese now. Welcome, Bishop. Over to you.
Thank you, Vanessa. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this on this virtual platform for our second in the series of webinars. Welcome to those who are joining us for the first time and those who were with us and able to join us again this week. The context, or what gave rise to the idea of initiating the process to provide space for dialogue and the sharing of ideas, was the approaching general elections in Guyana. As we probably all know, that's set for Monday, the 1st of September, just a little over 2 weeks from now. Guyana's elections in the past has frequently been tainted by some flashpoints, tensions, sometimes related to the ethnic composition of parties, sometimes because of mistrust of the system, and sometimes a bit of turbulence with the transfer or the continuance of power. Our CARICOM neighbors, namely Trinidad and Tobago and Suriname, had elections, each of them, earlier this year. In both of these countries, the whole electoral process went quite smoothly. We want to take a cue from this. Smooth electoral process is possible. In this vein, we have invited persons from Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname, and of course Guyana, who are involved in politics and/or have good knowledge of the matters of the nation to serve as moderators and panelists on our webinars. Our hope is that through these conversations, we can bring some light and new life to the politics, the electoral processes, to good governance, to good civil society involvement, not only in Guyana, but throughout our region. That as a region, we can really be known for the way in which as nations we just function in a very democratic way. The topic tonight will look at system strengthening, asking the question, how do we build legitimacy and efficacy in our election-related systems to prevent grievances before they take root? So, our conversation tonight. Over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Bishop. Our moderator tonight is Ardeen Sergio. Ardeen is a Trinidadian broadcaster, presenter, and producer who boasts 15 years plus in the media sector. She now serves as a civil society lead at the Copper Foundation, an organization focused on sustainable, responsible development in alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals. Ardeen, I now hand the forum over to you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Thank you so much, Father, and for the opportunity to be here this evening. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second installment in this dialogue series. It is a true honor to be able to share this opportunity with you and to be part of what I consider fundamentally a regional dialogue. I love to be in spaces where we get to exchange and explore ideas and the realities as well as Caribbean nations and peoples. So today, as both Vanessa and Father have identified, our topic is system strengthening. What must we do to ensure that election-related systems grow in legitimacy and efficacy and do not provide grounds for grievance? And I'm sure you'd agree this discussion is timely, not only because of the forthcoming elections in Guyana, but also because of the backdrop against which the elections and, of course, this dialogue is taking place. I'm sure we'd agree as well that with the shifting global dynamics, the upheavals that we see in certain places, political paradigms as well, uh, democracy seems to be facing some significant existential challenges. And of course, we know that the electoral process, elections, underpin that system that many of us have come to know. As flawed as it may be, it is the least imperfect, some would say, of the systems we have. It is what we do have, however, and we do recognize the merits of it. And so there are some deep questions we have to ask ourselves. And I think when we talk about elections, I mean, that's, foundational to the idea of democracy. Ultimately, that's what we are striving towards. We think a healthy democracy where we can enjoy a peaceful transfer of power. And so again, I want to emphasize the importance of this dialogue in that regard. So my job here this evening is to take you through a discussion with our two esteemed panelists and then open up the floor for your questions and comments. In fact, throughout the conversation, we'll be inviting you to please leave your comments and questions in the chat. Of course, we do invite more questions because we imagine you have lots to ask of our two panelists, both from one from Suriname, the other from Trinidad and Tobago. And so I'll introduce them now and we'll get going. So our first panelist this evening, he is Antoon Karg, and he is from Suriname. He's an attorney there, a father of two children, and co-founder of the Party for Justice and Development. He has an extensive academic background and an impressive career in the legal world. He obtained his bachelor's from the University of Amsterdam, went on to complete his master's in international and European law, at that same university. He started his legal career in earnest in Rotterdam, and there he gained experience in civil law, corporate law, labor, and corporate litigation. Since 2019, he's been an attorney and co-founder of Northwest Legal NV in Paramaribo in Suriname. And before establishing his own firm, he worked as a legal associate and an attorney at the Lim Apo law firm. So we want to welcome Antoon this evening from Suriname. And then we have also joining us Neil Parsonlal from Trinidad and Tobago, who is a prominent national here in TNT, where I also happen to be based and from. He has a diverse background in politics, education, and community advocacy. He served as Member of Parliament and Minister of Information, and has also chaired the National Library and Information Systems Authority here in this country, focusing on library access in underserved communities. Neil started his career as a teacher, reporter, and newspaper editor before moving to government and consultancy. He's currently the CEO of Peepsel Consultancy, discussing mental health and community support. He has advocated for libraries in high crime areas and linked creative arts to crime prevention, and remains dedicated to education, social equity, and innovative community development strategies. So, with that, I want to welcome you both this evening, Antoon and Neil. It's a pleasure to be joined by you both, who are obviously well placed to talk about the discussion at hand this evening. So, I think we'll get going with our first question, which really sets the tone, I think, for where we want to go this evening. But I think because we are talking about election systems, it is important, I think, for us to identify that both Suriname and Trinidad and Tobago function under very different election systems, electoral systems. And one we describe as first past the post in Trinidad and Tobago. The other is proportional representation in Suriname. And I think while we do want to definitely talk about the strength of the electoral systems in both countries that actually supported this peaceful transition of power, I think it's vital for our audience to get a sense of those differences. So, Antoon, I'll start with you by asking you, to give us just a brief overview of the electoral system of proportional representation, how it works in in Suriname, and then you can let us know how the strengths of that system have helped in realizing this peaceful transfer of power.
Thank you so much. First of all, many thanks to the organizations for your hospitality, and thank you for joining us this evening. So the road to getting to a representative democracy and a representative system has not been easy. It has been a long discussion because we come from a district system, and only through intervention of the Constitutional Court and the National Assembly has it very recently been changed. So this was our first election this year under full representative democracy with this system. It simply means that the political parties are the combinations which present an electoral list, list their candidates, pay the costs, and present their candidates, after which on election day the votes are cast and then tallied at around evening time. and simply the parties which have gathered the most votes are assigned seats in the parliaments, and the ones that did not are not assigned seats. After which parties get into discussions with each other about forming a coalition and assigning government.
Thanks. I was speaking while muted. Anton, thanks for that background. I think maybe you can share how you think um, the strengths of that system, well, firstly, what they are, and how they have lent themselves to the promotion of this peaceful transition in power, even as we look at such a recent change. Maybe speak to us a little bit about that and how you think it has improved um, how elections work in your country.
I think two factors contributed to ethnic division under the former system, because the district system historically resulted in living enclaves of people from diverse ethnic backgrounds, and the number of seats in parliament were not proportionally assigned under the old system, which meant that for certain districts, a lot more power, a lot less votes were required to gain more power in parliament, which in turn led to more governmental influence on behalf of certain ethnic groups. That has been leveled out now quite a bit because of the disappearance of the district system. So that resulted in two main changes. One is that the living enclaves were either sparse sparse distribution of small number of groups, which led to an outsized influence both in parliament and in government, has leveled out a bit. And on the other side, the impossibility for political parties to specifically and ethnically target areas with very regionally focused promises or very ethnic focused promises. So this election has seen an adjustment in those circumstances.
Oops. Do you make any correlation between the changes and maybe the way people responded to the results of the election? Or do you think that Suriname has just more traditionally now embraced peaceful elections? So this is just a continuation of that tradition.
I think it definitely played a part in an adjustment to a reconfiguration of the kind of candidate which was presented. I think there was a more focus on some parties bet on a more multi-ethnic list, and some parties simply chose to embrace traditionality. But I think it's easy to get lost in one important factor, and that's that the former dictator of Suriname passed in the year of the election. So that brought about a major shift in how parties were organized, and in the fact that some voting centers and voting blocks were allowed to be more mixed than they were before.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful, Antun. And I think a good start. And so, Neil, we'll go to you now to give us some context for Trinidad and Tobago, where the first past the post system has been the go-to after our British inheritance. And there are 41 constituencies in Trinidad and Tobago. How do you see the strengths of our system or the system in Trinidad and Tobago affecting how people respond to the results of the election?
And like Anton, I just want to begin by thanking the organizers. This is a continuation of some work that has been that Bishop has been doing in Guyana and Lawrence and the whole team in Guyana. I think it's very, very important because there's always that sense that the church must stay out of this. Church must stay out of things like politics. And the fact that the church is speaking and the church is actually pulling civil society together to have this kind of conversation, I think is admirable. And it really continues the work of successive popes, who have spoken to the need for that social and political reach, so that we affect the entire lives of our communities. So that being said, the first past the post system in Trinidad and Tobago has been with us since the first election of 1956. We have a long history of, and I think that has contributed to the peaceful transition of power. We have had that long history of peaceful elections. Our first past the post system simply says that whichever candidate in the constituency gets the majority of the votes is the person who ends up in parliament. There's been a lot of debate about whether that is the most efficient system. We know that Basileou Pandé, for instance, former Prime Minister Basileou Pandé, had advocated for a proportional representation system similar to Guyana and similar to what Suriname is now embracing. And I should say that the first past the post system operates for our general elections. So that's elections to the parliament. But because we have the general elections and the local government elections, we do in fact in Trinidad have both the first past the post system and the system of proportional representation. Because in the local government system we have, that's the allocation of all the men, not the councillors, but the allocation of all the men is done on the basis of proportional representation, the amount of votes that are cast. So we do have in Trinidad a hybrid or both systems in place. But I think primarily the fact that we've had a history of peaceful elections, we've had a history, notwithstanding the no vote campaign of 1971, but we have had a history of peaceful elections in Trinidad and Tobago. I think what has contributed to that peaceful transition as well is the legitimacy of our Elections and Boundaries Commission. The legitimacy, some will question my use of the word efficacy of the EBC, but I think the efficiency and the efficacy also, is responsible for that peaceful transition. It's a very, on election day, the EBC is very, very responsive. So in the last general election, for instance, they must have gotten about close to, I think at the last count, they must have gotten about 50 complaints from one particular party, practically all of which they were able to respond to before the election was over. So that lends itself to legitimacy and to trust, that people trust the EBC. And the fact that it is a constitutionally appointed, the commissioners are appointed by the president in consultation with both the prime minister and the opposition leader. So that lends itself as well to the legitimacy of the body that is responsible for the administration of elections. The fact that we had, observers as well, regional observers, I think the Commonwealth observers were here as well. And it's a curious thing I found when I contested the election, where there are actually scrutineers from each party allowed in every single polling station. So the scrutineers are allowed, you see them in every single polling station from every party that is contesting. And that follows straight through to the counting of the ballots. So that there is that sense that, the efficiency, but also the integrity of the elections, of the ballot casting, as well as the counting of the votes. And I think those things, play a lot in terms of strengthening or the strength of the system that allows for that peaceful transition of power. I think the fact that we get results, before the night is over, who's won the election. Before, in fact, at the last election, by 10 o'clock, you knew who won. People came and gave their concession speech, and everybody went home and sleep. So the rapidity of the election results also allows for that peaceful transition of power. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Neil, for preempting my follow-on question about the EBC and the role that it plays. But it's a great segue, and it is an important strength, I think, to be able to identify. I think, Ant, it would be great to hear from you what version of that body exists in Suriname and how it is received and perceived by the public at large, and of course the political parties with whom the EBC has to interact in such a time of high tension sometimes.
Thank you. So there are two main bodies involved with the electoral organization. The first is the Central Electoral Bureau, which is tasked with all the executive functions when it comes to logistics. The second body is the Independent Bureau for Elections, and they are tasked with monitoring, they're tasked with verification, and with confirmation. And these are appointed somewhat independently. My personal recommendation would be, as Neil mentioned, for both the coalition leaders and the opposition leaders to be more involved. At the current rate, they are appointed by the president without direct oversight from the parliament. So one of my recommendations would be to have a closer involvement with opposition leadership as well as with parliament or maybe even the courts, just to ensure that the feeling of independence and carrying of legitimacy is brought forward more. Currently, it is the ruling party and mainly the president who appoint leadership at both bodies. It has not been very controversial so far, but it would strengthen the system a lot to have more involvement and more legitimacy through involvement of the opposition just by force of their involvement.
Thank you, Antun. And I just want to remind our listeners, our folks joining us online, please continue to leave your messages and your comments, questions in the chat. We'll get to them a little bit later on in the discussion this evening. Antun, I do want to stick with you for a bit because it seems like you do appreciate the value of inclusivity, and the idea of bringing both opposition and ruling party together in this process. And I am curious about how people respond to, and people, and when I say people, I mean the political parties themselves, to the use of technology or the introduction of technology in the election system, in the electoral process. Is that something, how does it currently work? Is it still very manual focused? Or have there been efforts to advance or make it more sophisticated via the use of technology? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So the entire process is currently manually done, with the exception of the possibility to verify the voters list. So the voters list consists for the entirety of Suriname of all names and addresses of those people who are eligible to vote. That part of the process has been done mostly digitally, with the possibility for objections to errors also digitally. But what has been an improvement and a way that technology has been involved in a more modern process is that the counting of the votes or the early exit polls have been made available digitally, somewhat in real time, which gave an early indication of what the results might have been, and also a feeling of legitimacy that the results, as they were announced later on, were in accordance with what was the expectation. So the counting of the votes themselves is still done manually, and it will require some changing of rules before it's possible to involve more technology in that. But responding and communication with the people and also giving them some transparency has been one area in which technology has been made available and has been used in a proper way.
And would you say there is a desire for the introduction of technology in the actual process of voting, for instance? Is that something that people seem to want?
There has been some discussion on it, but the discussion has focused mainly on costs. There is also a bit of skepticism on possibilities for either fraud or intransparencies. I would say that it's about 50-50 on how people respond to it. But the main focus on discussing it from both coalition and opposition has been on lower costs.
Got it. Thank you, Antun. Neil, what do you make of the situation with respect to technology and how we integrate it so far in Trinidad and Tobago? And is there an interest or desire for it? Is it even a topic of conversation, per se?
To answer the last question first, I haven't really heard that conversation about us, moving towards a more digital, space in terms of our elections. From what I know, it's still a very, very laborious and manual, very labor-intensive type operation. I recall, and this is not because I was there, because I don't think I was that young at the time, but I think it was Dr. Williams in 1971 who tried to introduce the voting machines And because of that, there was a boycott of the elections. So this was way back in 1971. A very progressive Eric Williams, who had been in power for just about 16 years, decided or thought of introducing electronic voting machines. And the hullabaloo that it created then, it just went by the wayside. But our process and processes are still very, very, very labor intensive. It's very manual. We do not have the benefit of exit polls. For instance, we don't have that. In fact, the use of electronics in any polling station is prohibited by law. You cannot use your cameras or your phones or anything like that within a space. And we know there have been attempts by persons to take pictures of their ballots before, and people have gotten into trouble for that. But yeah, still very, very manual, still very, very labor-based, very paper-based. The question of the verification, and Antonio had raised the verification of our voters' lists. Even that is done. I mean, the EBC, if you pass by any corner shop, in Trinidad and Tobago, you will still see remnants today of a voters list that was pinned by that shop, so that anybody from the rank and file, anybody in the community can say, this person is dead, this person no longer lives there. So there's still a very, and then the EBC would actually send their people into the field for field verification. So a lot of it is still very, very manual. I think we need to have an integration of our systems, because a simple thing, the Ministry of Social Development, for instance, has a system where pensioners, for instance, must renew their life certificate every 6 months in order for them to continue receiving their pension. To me, that's a very simple way of verifying whether people are alive or not. And so an integration with the EBC and the Ministry of Social Development can very easily cut out, some of that. So that kind of cross-fertilization of ideas, that kind of cross-cultural cooperation amongst ministries, I think will help a lot in ensuring the integrity of our voters list, going forward.
And I think we're already moving on now to the question of room for improvement. What can be done in both contexts, in both Suriname and Trinidad and Tobago, to really improve the way the process is conducted, the way the system works, so that people do have the level of confidence we need them to have in the results at the end of the day. And I think that question of trust and confidence has already come up from both of you in different respects. So, Anton, I'll start with you. Maybe you can highlight some of the areas for improvements that you have not yet done. I know that you've already identified a couple, but what other points can you make around room for improvement?
One important point I would like to make has very little to do with the system itself, and has very much to do with the contents of the politics and the style of the leadership and the leadership culture. The system in Suriname for the past decades has always required forming coalitions and being upfront and truthful about parties or about ideas that people are very unwilling to embrace, or people want to keep forming an opposition to, has been a challenge for leadership on all sides. There have been very firm words said about people who were unwilling to work together with this party or that party, this leader or that leader, to within not even 24 hours or 48 hours to do an about face and embrace and form a coalition. I think there should be a stringent culture for three main options in approaching the electorate, and that is saying that you are either ready to work with anyone, that you have very firm restrictions of the people you are unwilling to work with and unwilling to speak to about forming a coalition, or somewhere in the middle of one of those two. But I do think that it's a very it's a flaw in the system for leaders to be able to swear off working together with either some people in leadership or a political party or a political philosophy entirely, to only a few days later embrace those people, because much of the reason for people to vote in Suriname is to get rid of some of the elements of corruption, some of the elements of mismanagement, and oftentimes very specific leaders who still find their way into a coalition, still find their way into government, and still keep control of very of intricate parts of government and of ruling power. So one very important improvement is not a system improvement, it's a leadership improvement. It's about transparency and honesty towards the voter of the people you are very unwilling to work with, and sticking to that promise once you've made it to the public.
And so you're not necessarily prescribing a rule to ensure that politicians say what they, or mean what they say, or do what they say, but you're saying that it's a question of integrity of the personalities themselves.
I think it's a question of discipline on the side of the voters. I think that voters, rather than rather than the ever seduction of voting strategically, should have a very strict rule about when the promise is broken, to stay away from certain leadership or to stay away from certain combinations, to never ever cast the vote for either the leader who broke the promise or the party that broke that promise. So people can be ensured that the main thing of what they're voting for or voting against is respected, and that is oftentimes the most egregious forms of corruption.
That's very interesting. Thank you so much, Antun. And an interesting perspective as well as how we think of, in terms of how we think of what could be improved in our different contexts. Neil, your thoughts?
Well, I just want to pick up with, from where Antun left off, because the history of coalitions in Trinidad and Tobago is one that, in fact, the only coalition governments, only coalition parties, or coalition of parties that have been successful in removing the People's National Movement from government. There has only been one occasion when a single party, and this is under Basti Pandey, this would have been, I think, 1995 or it was 2000, where where his party won an election, but then lost. Not, in fact, the government collapsed not too long after that. But that history of coalition governments, it's only coalition governments that have removed the People's National Movement, from government, and that's an interesting, because when you look at the coming together of the parties, I mean, there are some very interesting dynamics even in the current configuration of the parliament and some of the ministries. And if I may, Dean, there's one particular ministry that I find also interesting to keep watching, which is our Ministry of Housing, where there's a minister and two junior ministers. But the two junior ministers have been at each other's, who come from two separate parties, and have been at each other's throats politically, with all kinds of name callings and all kinds of things. And they have been put into the same ministry. So there are those of us who are just sitting on the outside now, just waiting to see how this is going to play out, because that is what, the trust, because you have two persons who were, at each other's throats from different political parties, now sitting in the same ministry, working together. So,
and I'm sure you and Antun could probably y'all can caucus around that particular issue. I'm sure.
It's interesting. But there are a couple of things I think that would help.
Mm-hmm.
And the first one, I like to think of it as strategic pillars. I refer to it. And the first one is really we can build trust in our democracy and in our electoral system through increasing the transparency that is involved. So that voters list preparation, voters list verification, the more we can have civil society involved in that verification process, in building that transparency, those are the things that will encourage persons to believe in the system, to believe that this system is actually going to work in their favor. So for us to be able to, firstly, to improve the transparency of the system. So it's not shrouded. We don't know who are the persons who have been submitted as commissioners, for instance. Who are the persons who the president might have put forward to the prime minister, to the sitting prime minister and the opposition leader. We don't know who they are, and we don't know. The public is not aware of the commissioners, of who the commissioners will be or are, until they're appointed. So that kind of transparency in terms of the election or the selection of the commissioners, I think that will go a long way in increasing trust and in the system. I think we could also go towards strengthening the institutional independence of the EBC. The EBC at the moment receives its funding via an allocation of the parliament. So whatever the parliament decides and whoever is in power and whatever they decide, given the national budgetary constraints, that is what the EBC gets. So at any point in time, that funding, and that is what brings independence. When you could control your own funding, that funding is determined by a bunch of politicians. And therefore, it means that in any given year, that allocation can be reduced or increased. Notwithstanding what is happening in the EBC, it is subject to the constraints of the national budget. So I think that is that institutional independence of the bodies charged with managing the election. I think that will also help in strengthening the democracy and strengthening the integrity of the system. I think we need as well to engage in a lot more and invest in a lot more civic education. The apathy is horrible. Voter apathy is horrible in Trinidad and Tobago. Local government elections, we get about 30% of the electorate voting. In the general election, we struggle now to cross 55% or so. So I think there has to be that investment in civic education, in persons actually helping to understand and it's not just a question of, you know how many people died so that you could get the vote, and it's not that, but understanding that every single decision, emanates or has its origins in a political decision. And therefore, so the decision to open a school, the decision to have free-flowing, pipe water, the decision about your electricity rates, those are governed by political decisions. And therefore, it's not a question of, I can't get involved, I don't get involved in politics. It's not that. We have to get involved. And so that investment in political education and civic education, I think a fourth one for me would be ensuring the technological integrity of the elections. I would love to see, for instance, that the entire electoral system or the IT infrastructure is on a completely separate platform from everything else that is going on in the country. Because God forbid somebody hack into that, into the national system, as they have in the past. It means that the electoral system could also be impacted. So a dedicated, secure, separate, independent, system for the EBC, so that it is not subject to the vagaries of anybody else's, whims and fancies.
And Neil, I think your previous point actually provides a perfect segue to get to where we want to go in terms of what do we really make of peaceful transitions of power? So we can assume that peaceful transitions of power suggest or are an indicator that people accept the results, they're happy with it, they're happy with how the elections were conducted. Or we could also maybe probe a little deeper to ask, to what extent are people really engaged and do they care? And are they involved? Do they feel like they are really a part of this process? And I think that's where we want to go, because we could take the evidence of, no violence, that those are important indicators, of course, for a healthy democracy. But I think there are definitely other questions to ask. So in both cases, for you and Antoine, and I'll start with you, Neil, since you brought up that point of apathy, of how we address it. Do you think that the election results, the acceptance of it, or the peaceful transition of power, rather, are an indication of a real acceptance of the strength with which our systems operate?
I think, if given the last couple of elections that I've witnessed, I think it is symptomatic of the apathy of the general population, that a perception that, well, whoever in power still had to go to work. Whoever win the election, I still had to go and hustle. Whoever win the election, I still, nobody's putting anything on my table. So that it's that resignation, perhaps. It's acceptance, but it's more a resignation that today, come tomorrow, I still have to get up and go to work. So whoever is in power doesn't affect me one way or the other. So yes, there is peaceful transition, But if 30% of your population is voting, then something is wrong. If only 50% of your eligible voting population is going out to cast their ballot, and it's not as though there was a storm, it's not as though there's a hurricane, it's not as though you have to climb Mount Everest to cast your ballot. But if you only have 30% in the local government elections and between 50 and 55 in the general elections, then something is definitely wrong. And part of it is that resignation that politics is not reaching where it is supposed to reach. And this is really touching, the bread and butter issues of the common population.
Thank you, Neil. Anton, what are your thoughts in Suriname? What do you think peaceful transition or transfer of power suggests or really indicates about the Suriname system?
So first of all, I share some of Neil's concern. We in Suriname in the past election we had engagement of about 53% of the possible vote, which is very worrisome. We come from 71% in the election before that, somewhere around the mid 70s, and we've had elections with up to high 80% of involvement. So that's a very worrisome development. It is curiously a development that also follows the educational trends. The educational trends and success within secondary education is shockingly at around the same numbers for that. I think there is some correlation between those numbers. I think involved civic society, people aware of their civil duties, are people that are interested, educated, and involved about what the election will mean at a much longer period before the election season. There's supposed to be an electorate that follow what happens with the taxes. Now, in Suriname at least, and I think also in Guyana for the past few years, government has worked itself into position that either through mining income or through other streams of revenue, taxes have not been top of mind for a lot of the voters, and tax policies have not been top of mind for a lot of the voters. Add to that in Suriname, much of the rural population is not even part of the tax base, and you come to a system where the resources available allow for politicians to form policies that have very little to do with the involvement of the households. The effects of policies on the households are not felt in the same manner as they were if a large tax base or a large tax involvement would come from the households and household incomes themselves. It doesn't affect them in the same way, which leads to the overall feeling that policies are some far-off game that do not involve the day-to-day of the people, as Neil has mentioned. I think that's one of the important matters. The other important matter for involvement, I think, is the point that I pointed to earlier, that promises made by politicians, not especially on a policy level, but at a compatibility level, on the warped sense of what even is a coalition or what even is an opposition if many of the smaller parties, many of the smaller ethnic groups line up with whoever comes out of the election the strongest, has destroyed the underlying base of a political philosophy, the underlying base of a political direction that leaders truly want to take the party in, which has also contributed to the low engagement, both in activism, political activism, when it comes to the part of young voters, young possible candidates, but as well to the electorate themselves, who are very wearisome of how much both the policies, the styles of leaderships, and the outcomes resemble each other.
This part of the conversation takes me back to a point that David Abdullah, one of the panelists last week, made about Dr. Williams, who in the 50s sought out to engage in public education around politics. It was a signature sort of move on his part to educate the population and elevate their understanding and the need to have them properly and widely engaged on issues of politics. And we have not really seen a political party, I would say, at least certainly not since I've been an adult, engage its base or the population, the wider population in that kind of way. And so what it sounds like you're both saying, I mean, Neil, you spoke about it certainly from the point of view of civic education and the responsibility that maybe the state bears for that, which is undeniable. But what sort of responsibility do political parties then have in sort of building the capacity of its base? And is it to their advantage to keep them sort of ignorant, in the dark, illiterate around so many very important issues? Oh, did I just ask a very obvious question?
Well,
Neil, you can start.
I remember one prime minister saying, and I'm not going to call his name, saying that elections is about a bunch of middle class people trying to manage a bunch of lower class people. And that's how you keep people. That's how you keep people. That's how you win your elections. Yeah.
Wow.
Very, very cynical. Very, very cynical. And I mean, we also had, politics has a morality of its own, which is another statement made by a prime minister. And I'm not going to say whether the two statements were made by the same prime minister.
Thank
But
you.
I think for me, as a former member of parliament and cabinet minister, for instance, I cannot see, for instance, the need there's no value for me in keeping an electorate in any state of ignorance. Because I think the more educated we are, the better we are able to make decisions. I mean, and yes, people can move from one party to the next, but my experience in looking at the Caribbean region, for instance, I don't know that the various political parties are so far apart philosophically in the first place. And we talk about who is Labour and who is, that, but I do not see, I mean, I've looked at Trinidad and Tobago, looked at Guyana, looked at Jamaica, looked at, Dominica that has a Labour Party, and I'm not seeing any fundamental difference. Barbados, any fundamental difference in philosophy between any of the political parties, or so divergent are their policies that one could say, yes, I am this, or no, I am, no, I am the other. I think it's important for us to try to educate and that's so those debates that Eric Williams had in Woodford Square with Dom Basil Matthews, and that was the heart of democracy. Patrick Manning tried it in his last incarnation when he was looking to change the constitution to move to a different constitution, where he talked about an executive president and that sort of thing. So there was a series of lectures, so to speak, throughout the country, but that didn't go anywhere. Once he left government, that was the end. But I think there's value in political parties educating their base. But if you're in you see, the task is to separate party from government. And therein lies part of the problem. We have a challenge in Trinidad and Tobago today, where the party in government is educating their constituencies about a particular piece of legislation that is to come to the parliament. But it is being done in the constituencies where they have members of parliament, and all the meetings are branded as that of the political party.
Yeah, those are political meetings. Yes.
So it's a political meeting. It's not, it's not education for the, for the masses, So the party is doing something for its base about legislation that is to come into the parliament for the national community. You see, how do we then separate party from government? And the history of some of these parties, the history of, in fact, of our political parties in Trinidad and Tobago, is that the minute they get into government, their party structure fails.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. You're absolutely right, Neil. We've noticed that conflation of party and ruling party very often in our history. And Toon, I'm curious about your thoughts on this issue of where the responsibility really lies to elevate the thinking of our population and the engagement of our population on matters of state.
Unfortunately, the situation is much more dire than described when it comes to Suriname. Political parties are not just uninterested in informing the base or the masses. They are uninterested in informing their own officers, their own party officers. For example, I'll give two examples. All major political parties strongly discourage during internal elections for an alternative board list for party leadership. All of them do. Whenever a unified party list is adopted, it's celebrated as a victory for the party. It's celebrated as a sign of trust in current leadership. But this actively discourages the possibility to ever even gain new blood within the leadership. Even if you were to come to two separate lists and give people the possibility to vote for a mixed board within a major political party, there would be some sign of a system resembling any kind of primaries, but it is strongly discouraged. Whenever somebody within a major party even has the ambition to do so, after the internal elections, party leadership sharply looks at ways to boycott whoever took that initiative. It's just one of the manners in which that is cut out. Another example that I can name in which that is done is one of the current ruling parties, which has a long tradition in Suriname, with a high-placed officer currently in government, prohibited even taking notes and making minutes of meetings within that party, which strongly poisons even the democratic formation or the democratic development of officers within the party. I'm not even speaking about the base. Officers within the party are discouraged from the main competencies that are needed to form a democratic sense or democratic balances. So that's how dire the situation is in Suriname. And I cannot say that even the new parties or the new blood that involves that have done a great job of involving the populace more, involving the masses more, or informing the masses or the base any more than that. I think if we look outside, there has been some discussion on how this internationally is conducted, and ruling parties often warn their base about not being both the competitor and the referee within the game of politics. And I think Suriname politics is a very scary extreme of how that comes to look. Because if there is no party who feels any responsibility to be an arbiter or an honest broker within the system, it's not going to come from any other source. And sooner or later, we result into a very poor imitation of democracy.
Oh, thank you both very much for that. I'm not sure if this is what the Guyana team had in mind when they thought they would learn from Suriname and Trinidad and Tobago, but hopefully you learn from our shortcomings as well. That's the idea. But so this is a good time, I think, for us to start looking at what folks are saying in our chat, both comments and questions. We do encourage you to leave your questions there. We are going to present them now, as well as your comments. We'll begin with this one from Danuta Radzik in Guyana. In Guyana, the party leader makes the decision who from the party list will take up parliamentary seats. Could the Surinamese rep indicate if, in Suriname's proportional representation system, the party lists show who will be the representatives in parliament? Do voters ultimately make the decision of who goes to parliament, or is there a separate process? Antun, that's for you.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Oh, sure. No problem. All right. So this one is from Danuta, and she's saying that in Guyana, the party leader makes the decision who from the party list will take up parliamentary seats. Could the Surinamese rep, that's you, Antun, indicate whether Suriname's PR system, the party list show who will be the representatives in parliament? Do voters ultimately make the decision of who goes to parliament, or is there a separate process?
About 2 months before the general elections, the Central Electoral Bureau publishes all the lists of parliamentary candidates, and also on election day itself, the electorate has the possibility to vote for any candidate on that list with a preference vote. So there's quite a bit of choice for individual voters. to elect individual parliamentarians.
Thank you. And there seems to be a lot of interest in how the list system works. Ali Majid, also from Guyana, is asking, can you and Toon say what type of list system you do have, closed or open?
Party leadership determines the list, so I would say it's rather closed.
Closed. Okay, great. And Lawrence Lachman Singh is asking, in webinar 1, there was some discussion about colonial legacies, particularly as regards the seeds of disunity and conflict. Has colonialism, whether Dutch or British, affected either positively or negatively the electoral or constitutional systems of Suriname and Trinidad and Tobago? And maybe, Neil, we can start with you. Would you say that colonialism, just to repeat, has affected positively or negatively the systems that we have in our countries?
I think as we inherited from the British our first past the post system. That is, that's clear. And with that came the kind of bicameral parliament that we have as well. So we have this idea of government, House of Representatives and the Senate, and that, but it's copied almost entirely. We still hold on to May's parliamentary procedure, as the guiding light for what obtains in the parliament. So there isn't anything that is indigenous. We have not created that set of that body of laws, so to speak, that would be truly indicative of how we conduct ourselves, in the parliament. The way we dress to go to the parliament, is we still have our speaker and president of the Senate dressed in these ornate, robes like the lords of the Privy Council, complete with all they removed is the powder wigs. So there's a lot that has that we've inherited from a colonial past, which has influenced how we look at our parliament, how we sound in the parliament, how we how we conduct ourselves in the parliament, and even the parliamentary system that we have in place at the moment.
And you wouldn't, sorry, excuse me. Would you say, Neil, that there's an overriding negative, negative or positive sort of attribute that you would ascribe?
I think there's value. There's value in everything, or the value can be extracted from any system, and I think there is value to be had from what we've inherited. But I would like to see, for instance, I mean, if you look at the Belizean Parliament, nobody there wears a jacket and tie. There's an authentic Belizean, outfit. We call it the shirt jacks. But these are long sleeve, things. But it's indicative of their particular and peculiar environment. We still walk around feeling that we still have to wear these jackets. Sorry, Antoon. But we still. So I think there's value, but I think we can continue to adapt. We can continue to modify and tweak so that it really represents who we are. We have not, for the entire Caribbean that has been, I mean, Jamaica celebrated their independence on the 6th of August. So this was just last week, and they are going into 60 years plus. Yeah, we will celebrate ours, at the end of the month. But there is no May's parliamentary procedure. There is no regional parliamentary procedure. Unfortunately, so much like the Privy Council, we are still dependent, on that body to determine, who we are.
Thanks, Neil. And Toon, what are your thoughts from a Suriname perspective on this question of colonial legacy?
Colonialism is the main driver of division in Suriname for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that the colonizers have benefited greatly from keeping ethnic groups separate, both in a political sense and in a geographical sense. and in widening the divisions during the period of colonialism itself. The other is that our political system has been copied from the Netherlands, and within the Netherlands itself, there had been a long period of pillarization within which both ethnic groups and religious groups stuck together when it came to the media they consumed, the political parties they voted for, the civil society that they decided to participate in. And this has been adopted in our political organizations, our experience of religious faith, our experience of civil societies, the holidays that we choose to celebrate. The entire system has been copied and has been a tremendous, tremendous failure for our country. But colonialism has many effects and many ghosts. It leads to a huge form of brain drain, because when our fine students reach the phase when they go for higher education, they usually leave for the Netherlands, our former colonizer, where they are both inducted with ideas of neocolonialism. They do not learn the worth of a self-identity. But also, some of our best brides never returned to Suriname to work in Suriname and live in Suriname as a capacity. So we have created a farm system for colonization to continue, and that stretches out until today and robs us of the very best of human potential that we have in Suriname.
And certainly the impacts are far and wide, beyond the electoral system. Another listener viewer is asking, her name is Jean Hanuman from Guyana. Can both panelists elaborate a little further on the steps taken by your countries to ensure transparency and fast election results? Perhaps you can tell us how you have improved your counting processes and to ensure non-political interference. Neil, would you like to go first?
I think generally election results are produced pretty quickly in Trinidad and Tobago. The ultimate verification by the EBC takes a little while longer, because I guess they have to ensure that it's double and triple counted. But the results coming out of the polling stations are usually done very, very quickly, because votes are actually counted in the polling station first and last, and then transported to the main headquarters of the EBC. So there is counting, and a counting that takes place on site at the polling station at the end of the voting process. So that ensures that there's a quick turnaround in terms of the election results from that particular polling station. The transmittal of those results to the EBC's office is what takes some time, because once those results are known at the polling station, the political parties get them, and that is what the political parties use now to determine what seats they've won and what seats or what seats they've lost. So those results usually come even before the EBC issues a final a final list, or a verified list per se. But the counting is done on site. It's manual, so you have to stand up and listen to for your candidate's name, and you have your verification, and the EBC would have their verification within the polling station as well.
And Neil, are you aware of whether there have been certain steps taken to improve that process over the years? Because sometimes when you're at home looking on television, following the results, you do get complaints about the degree to which you get timely results. Sometimes you find yourself looking at a map that is taking forever to fill out, and things are just coming in very slowly. So I was just wondering if you're aware of any efforts maybe to improve how that is transmitted to the public.
I'm not aware of any. The results that the political parties get, which the media uses, because the media on election night does not use the EBC results.
Yes.
Media uses the results obtained by the political parties from their agents within the polling stations. So at the end of the night, we don't get the results from the EBC. We get the results from the political parties. Yeah, and that is transmitted in real time to the political parties, their headquarters, And then they are the ones who say, well, yes, we've won, no, we've lost, that sort of thing. But I do not know of any recent, attempts to improve the EBC's part of the rapidity of that result, or the dissemination of results. I'm not sure that there's been anything done in that vein.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Antun, on your end?
Much as Neil described, there's a two-pronged system, of which the first is the on-site tallying, with scrutineers from most major parties present, and the possibility to raise challenges at the polling stations themselves, which happens a bit, but gives a feeling of transparency. After that, the votes are transported to the central headquarters, where they are counted again, verified again, and where scrutineers may be present. Now, in these last elections, the results at the central polling stations were announced as exit poll numbers within a digital system that anyone could log on to, facilitated by the Ministry of Interior. And on the one hand, this gave a feeling of transparency, but once it got past some certain number of votes, it took a while, and that gave an uneasy feeling. So there is room for improvement there, but some digital measures are experimented with.
All right, thank you very much. I hope that answers the question you had, Jean. And now we go to Colin Klotke, also from Guyana. Politicians and institutions have a key role to play in electoral processes. What is the advice and experience from the panelists regarding strengthening the role of civil society in ensuring peaceful and fair elections? All right, so we're asking for your views on the role of civil society in ensuring peaceful and fair elections. Neil, we'll come to you.
I don't see in Trinidad and Tobago any major civil society group really at the forefront of voter education or political education. It almost always stems from the political party themselves. Part of the challenge we have is the funding that is required. Because for civil society to get involved in voter education and that kind of civic education, they would need to get funding. And I'm not aware of any group that is dedicated and almost entirely to education along political lines. It is always the challenge, because the challenge we have is that part of it is the myopia of our politicians and of the political system, where anybody who is seen to be educating the public, if that education is not aligned to a particular political party, well, then you're anti that political party. And it's still the small-mindedness, I think, the myopia that is evident. Because if in that political education you espouse a view that is contrary to what the party in power has, then it must mean that you're anti the government, and you'll be dealt with in a particular way. So I'm not while it is the ideal, while it is something that has to be promoted a lot more, the funding for those kinds of organizations must come, and it cannot come from the government. It has to be sought from elsewhere, because if the government is funding this, then of course there is that sense it delegitimizes the work of the educational aspect of it. Yeah, so it has to come from outside.
What I would say, and I should also mention that question from Colin is actually a paraphrased question of a wider comment that he offered, and it's available in the chat for anyone who wants to see them. I think what we've also seen over the years, and maybe Antun, you can talk about whether the degree to which this exists in Suriname is the emergence of individuals or maybe groups of individuals who decide that they want to do more data-driven or present more data-driven research to the population. So we currently have this platform here in Trinidad and Tobago called the Pekong Party. I don't know if you've seen it, Neil.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It's an excellent platform that is really dedicated toward covering the history of the electoral processes, the results, and providing analysis of those results in comparative ways with historical references so that you can actually get that kind of public education. And I want to encourage folks to maybe check it out, because I think what it demonstrates is that there is room for civic engagement, but it does require individuals often with an interest and the resources maybe and the skills needed to intervene in that kind of way that ultimately lends to the upliftment of the population. So maybe, Anton, you can tell us what you're aware of in terms of civil society or even individual citizens acting to help add to the debate and the process in your country.
Thank you. I think there are many participants, a strong involvement of international and diplomatic missions, supranational organizations, NGOs, civil society in general, and business interests as well, has helped bring Suriname back from the brink of dictatorship a number of times. 5 ways in which they have majorly contributed. The first of which is education. The second of which, and I see several participants in the chat of doing that, has been program analysis, because Suriname parties, especially the major parties, write very lofty prose about how they want to better society, but it gets very non-understandable for the masses to obtain that information. So translating that information and giving a degree of a program analysis has been one very helpful and key way in which civil society has contributed. Another one is issuing warnings when things tended to go more on the side of dictatorship, or when the economic policies did not match the promises that were made. Civil society has been very important in issuing those warnings when those gaps got too wide. The fourth one is that as a reminder of ethics, and I think especially the religious organizations have been important in giving reminders of certain ethic principles which cannot be violated either during the elections or in the run-up to elections or even during the formation stages. I think especially the religious organizations have been very important in sending a certain message and seeking leadership in discussions and even in challenges when these principles have been violated. The fifth one is that the first edition of digital monitoring was entirely something that came from civic society and business interests who provided the means to come up with the first version of digital monitoring. This put pressure on the government to come up with their own version and also gave them valuable data and valuable source code in forming the system that's currently used.
When you refer to digital... Yes, sure, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think one of the questions that I have asked, in the past, and I continue to, what is the role of our universities in all of this? Because that is one area, that is one body that can in fact provide, or be a source of that kind of intellectual challenge, that kind of intellectual thought, that kind of public and civic education. If we recall the 1970s, the Black Power Revolution in Trinidad and Tobago had a lot of its genesis at the university campus. That is when voter education became, or public education, civic education, became a real thing in Trinidad and Tobago in 1970s. That began on the campus. What is the role of our universities, whether it is in Suriname, whether it's in Guyana, whether it's in Trinidad and Tobago, in fostering that increase in interest in voter education and political education for that matter, because all those universities have a political department.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you. That's definitely an important consideration. Anton, I just wanted to pick up on the point you made about digital monitoring. What exactly are you referring to when you say digital monitoring?
Publication of the exit polls.
Okay. Okay, got it. Thank you. All right. So I think that's it in terms of questions from the audience for now. We do have a few minutes left, but there was one question we didn't quite get to in our panel discussion, and that had to do with the use of communications, digital communications, social media. To what degree do we see our Election and Boundaries Commission in Trinidad and Tobago and its counterpart in Suriname, to what degree do we see these bodies really relying on modern communications to inform and engage the public? And do we see more of the engagement around elections in general happening, apart from the campaigning, of course, by political parties, in terms of information itself and proper engagement? Do we see more of that happening online? Antun?
Videos, photos, and quick responses of perceived irregularities, but also the responses to the responses are published, and I think that could be helpful. It could also lead to a form of abuse. I think it's important to not just rely on social media and on virality for that, but to have actual credible, honest brokers interfere with it and be in touch with the administrators of such platforms to remove things that are used to manipulate, as we have seen happen in major countries and major democracies.
Thank you for that, Antun. And Neil, any thoughts on that?
I think the question of how do we it come back to how much do we trust our systems? You know, how much do we trust the system that we have in place to give us the results in a timely manner, in a manner that is devoid of seemingly of the bias? I think if we can do those kinds of things, then that will help us in terms of increasing that transparency and the legitimacy of our electoral systems. The EBC, I think, it cannot only operate at election time, or cannot only be seen to be operating at election time. There is a group in Trinidad that speaks to the observers of but they just about the election. The EBC must be consistent throughout the year in terms of that voter education, and not only be seen when there is an election campaign. It has to be that voter education and what voter education is supposed to be about is something that is done throughout the year.
Well, Neil and Antun, on that note, I do want to thank you so very much for taking the time and sharing your expertise and your vast experience as well with our audience this evening. I think there's no denying how much we benefited from having you here to share with our Guyanese counterparts, who hopefully have learned not just from the strengths, but from the weaknesses of our respective systems. I think we all have a lot to learn from each other as we continue on this path. And of course, this is just webinar 2 in 3 dialogues taking place ahead of the elections in Guyana on September 1st. This one was system strengthening, so we focused a lot on the election process itself. Whereas next week, for webinar 3, we'll be looking at rights and values. And so we're moving on to talk about the Constitution. So we're asking the question for next week: how do we strengthen a national consensus on constitutional values so that we engage each other peacefully at election times? I think that's a great question. And it makes sense that, we started last week with reconciliation and trust. And now we're talking systems, and now we're going on to the bigger, more sort of philosophical questions around and the role that those questions play and the answers we find to them in ensuring that we have the peaceful outcomes that we all desire. So I want to thank you both once again, Antun and Neil, for your presence here this evening and your time. Of course, everyone who's made the effort to spend this last 90 minutes with us, we do appreciate it. And of course, for the organizers for just bringing us here to be part of this discussion and to be part of a really important process in Guyana at this time. So Vanessa, I'll hand back over to you now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ardeen. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us tonight and for staying with us during this discussion. It was certainly a thought-provoking discussion. We were able to delve into your questions, which obviously provided a lot of scope for where we are. We heard a few key messages coming out of our panelists in terms of things or that could strengthen our electoral system. And some of those key takeaways would be the verification of voters' lists, coalition governments, integrity of the leadership, discipline on the side of the voters, separating parties from governments, strengthening institutional independence of our electoral management bodies, and investment in civic education. As Ardeen mentioned, next week we will meet same time, same place for session 3 or webinar 3, and we will focus on rights and values as we continue to explore what it is that will lead us to just electoral peace, which we hope would be a lasting peace within our society. I want to say on behalf of the organizing team, a special thank you to our moderator and our panelists who certainly led us on a very interesting discussion tonight. We thank you again, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us, for your questions, for your comments, and we look forward to seeing you here next week. As always, we encourage you to please share the link with persons whom you think are like-minded and would want to be a part of this discussion. We are also streaming on YouTube, and so we encourage you to go there as well. You can re-look at this broadcast, and you can also share it with your circles. Again, thank you, and do have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye. Good night.
Bye, everyone.